The subject of our discussion today, exceptionally, is both Isaiah chapter 3 and Isaiah chapter 4. And as you can well imagine, this is not because there was insufficient material to present with respect to each chapter by itself. More than adequate material for many sessions on each of these chapters. But the truth is that dividing these verses into two chapters, chapter 3 and chapter 4, is so artificial and so divorced from the unitary connection between the diverse parts of the chapters that considering them together is almost an inevitability. It's important for us to bear in mind here, as a general observation, that the division of the books of the Bible into the conventional chapters is, in almost every instance, a relatively recent innovation that became popularized as a result of the printers who printed the Bible with the chapters and verses. But in the original, traditional Jewish formulation of the Hebrew Bible, the divisions were not into chapters, which inevitably means that besides conjoining chapters 3 and 4, we also really need to consider both of them in light of chapter 2 that comes before. And in that vein, perhaps the best way of beginning our discussion of chapter 3 is with a very brief review of some of the salient themes of chapter 2. First of all, recall the manner in which chapter 2 begins. The word that Isaiah, the son of Amos, prophesied concerning Judah and Jerusalem. This opening verse is especially significant for today's discussion, inasmuch as there is no parallel title line to Isaiah chapter 3, which means inevitably that what we read in chapter 3 and on through chapter 4 is a continuation of the same title, the word that Isaiah, the son of Amos, prophesied concerning Judah and Jerusalem, which, as we shall see, is especially germane when we consider the content of chapter 3 and into chapter 4, because this is the focal point. That is, geographically, right here. Now, recall that after that opening line of Isaiah chapter 2, there was a rousing passage that we've quoted many times and that we discussed at length, that it shall come to pass in the end of days, the mountain of God's house will be established as the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall stream unto it. And of course, the vision of beating swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Well, that brought us through verse 4 in chapter 2. Recall that what followed afterward were stern words of rebuke, speaking of the descent of the people into the depths of depravity, idolatry, but not just idolatry, the arrogance, the hubris, that in some sense really is the root of all of the evils described. And the recurrent theme, in order to right that wrong, in order to remedy that pridefulness, in verse 9
and man bows down, and man has become humble, and you cannot forgive them. Because still and all, the problem continues. And the warning in verse 10, enter into the rock and hide you in the dust from before the terror of God and the glory of his majesty. Verse 11, the lofty looks of man shall be humbled, and the haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and God alone will be exalted in that day. And of course, in the continuation of chapter, emphasizing by way of metaphor the need to humble all that is lofty, all that is lifted up. And again, verse 17, the loftiness of man shall be bowed down, the haughtiness of men will be humbled, and God alone will be exalted in that day. And what follows, words of stern warning. In verse 19, and men shall come into the caves of the rocks and into the holes of the earth, from before the terror of God and the glory of his majesty, when he arises to shake mightily the earth. And finally, the last words of chapter 2, cease you from man, in whose nostrils is a breath, for how little is he to be accounted. And on the one hand, that undoubtedly is the parting note of chapter 2. How little is he to be accounted? As the remedy for that arrogance, that pride that was so decried by the prophet in the previous verses. And yet, inevitably, there's more to this picture. On the one hand, there's more to this picture because, the focus upon pride and arrogance is, as we shall see, very central in the continuation in chapter 3. There's more to this picture, though, also, because the cure for the arrogance is not simply telling people you are insignificant, you are unimportant. Maybe, if anything, the cure lies in understanding where our true importance is to be found. Because when we don't have a sense of our justified importance, when we don't appreciate where our true significance lies, then, in the wake of the resultant insecurities, we seek to justify ourselves in all sorts of pathetic, hopeless expressions of pride and of arrogance. The very structure of society, as a result, can become so utterly decadent, so thoroughly eroded, that society itself breaks down. And it is on that note that we plunge into the even stronger words of rebuke, the even stronger medicine of chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 1. For behold, the Lord, the God of hosts, does take away from Jerusalem and Judah. Remember, this is the prophecy concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Once again, stay and staff. God's taking away all of the support of Jerusalem and Judah. Every stay of bread and every stay of water. In context, it becomes clear that we aren't talking about a famine or a drought. The stay of bread, the stay of water, in the Hebrew, the mish'an, is that which supports, that which provides. The infrastructure that provided the food and the water, that is, the leadership. And the list of the leaders who are swept away continues. In verse 2, the mighty man and the man of war, the judge and the prophet and the diviner and the elder. Verse 3, the captain of 50 and the man of rank, and the counselor and the cunning charmer and the skillful enchanter, or alternatively, the skillful craftsman and the one who understands secrets, all of them swept away. No leaders left. As a result, verse 4, I will give children to be their princes, and babes, we could render the Hebrew also as scorners, shall rule over them. They don't really have leaders left. And those who are ruling over them are utterly ill-equipped to lead. And because they are so ill-equipped to lead, and because, as a result, society itself is breaking down. In verse 5, and the people will oppress one another, every man his fellow, and every man his neighbor. The child shall behave insolently against the aged, and the base against the honorable. All the societal norms, decency, are completely missing. And ironically, as we know in so many other contexts in life, hitting rock bottom can also herald the beginning of the rehabilitation. For now, it gets worse. Verse 6, for a man will take hold of his brother of the house of his father. You have a mantle, you be our ruler. And let this ruin, this obstacle, state, be under your hand. And the response, I will not be a leader, for in my house is neither bread nor mantle. You will not make me a ruler of a people. If the crime of arrogance led everyone to want to be in charge, now no one wants to be in charge. What they see before themselves is utter ruin. For Jerusalem is ruined, has stumbled. And Judah is fallen, because their tongue and their doings are against God to provoke the eyes of his glory. The show of their countenance witnesses against them, and they declare their sin as Sodom, they hide it not. And they're beyond even the trappings of the hypocrisy that conceals wrongdoing. Woe unto their soul, for they have wrought evil upon themselves. So again, at this stage, we're speaking of a breakdown of society, the ruin that necessarily follows when there is no societal structure remaining, and the antidote to the arrogance and the pride and people not even wanting to rule. But there's an additional dimension. And if anything, this additional dimension, I would argue, implies that there is importance in every human being. Critical significance. Verse 10 seems almost coming from nowhere. Say you of the righteous that it shall be well with him, for they shall eat the fruit of their doings. Versus, woe unto the wicked, it shall be ill with him, for the work of his hands shall be done to him. Now, there's a critically important theme here, and it's important to note how frequently we encounter it in the Bible elsewhere. The fruit of their doings. Eating the fruit of their doings. This is a theme that we encounter in many other passages of the prophets, in Isaiah's contemporary Micha, in chapter 7, verse 13, again, the fruit of their doings. In Jeremiah repeatedly, everyone getting in chapter 17, verse 10, according to the fruit of his doings. In chapter 21, verse 14, I will punish you according to the fruit of your doings. In chapter 32, verse 19, to give everyone according to his ways and according to the fruit of his doings. And in similar terms, in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 31, to eat of the fruit of their own way, essentially the same metaphor. Likewise, in Proverbs chapter 12, verse 14, the fruit of his mouth, the doings of a man's hands, shall be rendered to him. What do all these passages mean? What does it mean to eat the fruit of one's doings? I think on the most basic plane, what it's telling you is, you don't get what you deserve. That would be too arbitrary. It's far more basic than that. You are what you have become. You are what you have made yourself. And of course, that operates in both directions. It operates in the positive direction. Again, say you of the righteous, it shall be well with them, for they shall eat the fruit of their doings. It operates also in the negative direction. With respect to the wicked, the work of his hands will be done to him. What he has done, what he's made of himself. There's an expression in English, what goes around, comes around. In much this vein, in Psalm chapter 37, we read of the wicked plotting against the righteous. And verse 15, their sword shall enter into their own heart. They draw the sword thinking that they will exploit it to advance their own wickedness, and the one who is, in fact, the real victim is, needless to elaborate here, their own selves. The sword enters their own heart. This is perhaps an unobvious antidote to the problem of pride and arrogance, but I think it actually plays a critical role in our appreciating how we really need to relate to our lives. Because if reward and punishment were bestowed upon us by God simply as an arbitrary act, God gives based upon some arcane formula of reward and punishment, then we might really conclude that our own lives, our actions are of no significance. Everything is in God's hands. God is supplying the reward. God is supplying the punishment. We're nothing. Not so, say the prophets. Not so. The message resonates throughout the Bible. Everything you're doing is significant. Not only that, the way you will perceive God manifest to you is a reflection of the way you're conducting your life. In the words of King David, in Samuel, second book of Samuel, chapter 22, essentially the same song appears, of course, in Psalms, in Psalm 18. I'm beginning here in the version in the book of Samuel, with verse 25. Therefore has God recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to my cleanness in his eyes. What he does to me is simply a reflection. What I am in his eyes, by virtue of what I have become. Because, as a general principle, with the merciful, we might prefer here the kind or the pious. You show yourself merciful, kind, pious. With the upright man, You show yourself upright with the pure. In verse 27, you show yourself pure. Conversely, and with the crooked, the perverse, you show yourself crooked. Always a reflection. Not again, merely getting what you deserve, but being what you have become. In much the same vein, in Proverbs chapter 3, beginning in verse 33, the curse of God is in the house of the wicked. How is it in the house of the wicked? Of course, they put it there. He blesses the habitation of the righteous because they engender that blessing. Continuing in verse 34, if it concerns the scorners, he scorns them. Unto the humble, he gives grace. Verse 35, the wise inherit honor, as for the fools, they carry away shame. It's always a reflection of what they are. And likewise, in Proverbs chapter 13, in verse 6, righteousness guards him who is upright or single-minded in the way. His own righteousness is what's protecting him. But wickedness overthrows the sinner. What is overthrowing the sinner? Not some arbitrary punishment, but rather the wickedness of the sinner himself is what overthrows him. Remember in the metaphor that we saw in Psalms, the sword of the wicked entering his own heart. In verse 21, evil pursues sinners. It's not God pursuing the sinners. Their own evil is pursuing them. But to the righteousness shall good be repaid. Whence the good? It's their own good. Again, what goes around comes around. You are what you have become. As a general principle, expressed in the book of Job, in chapter 34, for the work of man, he requites unto him, and cause every man to find according to his ways. Always a reflection. What you are is what you have made yourself. Perhaps the most apt metaphor in this regard, as expressed in Psalm 121, verse 5, God is your keeper. God is your shadow upon your right hand. It's an interesting metaphor. It should give us pause. What do we mean by speaking of God being a shadow upon one's right hand? Well, consider what you do with your right hand and what your shadow does. Of course, it's obvious to all of us. The shadow is precisely a reflection of whatever it is that you're doing. You move your hand, your shadow moves the same way. The way God treats us is precisely the way we treat ourselves and others. Again, this is the very opposite of putting down man regarding us as insignificant. On the contrary, God himself will be manifest to us as a reflection of what we do. Because what we do determines what we are. What we are is more than anything else a product of ourselves. And what we call reward and punishment is just simply that. What we are. What we ourselves have become. Now, returning in this vein to Isaiah chapter 3, of course, we're still in pretty tough straits because society is breaking down. There are no leaders. And maybe it's precisely this appreciation of how significant we can be and should be by choosing the right. that results in no one wanting to be in charge. In verse 12, as for my people, a babe is their master. Again, alternatively, we read that as a scorner is their master. They have no leadership. They're simply wandering aimlessly because everything is simply breaking down. And perhaps most dire is the consequence with respect to the framework of judgment and what should be the protection of the weak members of society. In verse 13, God stands up to enter into judgment and stands to judge the peoples. Verse 14, God will come into judgment with the elders of his people and the princes thereof. And as emerges clearly in the continuation of the verse and the verse that follows, what that means is the judges aren't judging. They're not doing their job. It is you who have eaten up the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. Not only are you not executing justice against the perpetrators of this evil who are despoiling the poor, you're complicitous in the crimes themselves. Verse 15, what mean you that you crush my people and grind the face of the poor? Says God, the God of hosts. This motif of God standing to judge the peoples is one with which we are familiar from Psalm 82, where indeed the self-same expression about God standing in the Hebrew, nitzav, appears as well. And it's instructive for us to consider the similarity here, because essentially it is the same problem and the same message. That is, in the first verse of Psalm 82, God stands in the congregation of God. In the midst of the judges, he judges. Now, what is that supposed to mean? How is God judging in the midst of the judges? Well, the ideal, what's supposed to be the case, is God judges, if you will, by proxy. In much the same vein as we appreciate the importance of human beings, inasmuch as it is our deeds, for better and for worse, that becomes the determinant of what we become and what we get. In other words, we become, as it were, God's partners in what happens in the world. In much the same vein, what are the judges supposed to be? We have, you will recall, discussed this previously in our studies of the Torah, in particular of Deuteronomy chapter 1, of Exodus chapter 21. The judges are supposed to be God's junior partners. When society functions as it should be functioning, God judges. By the judges, the human judges, executing justice as he has charged us. Unfortunately, what becomes clear in Isaiah chapter 3 and in Psalm 82 is that's not happening. In Psalm 82, verse 2, how long will you judge unrighteously and favor the persons of the wicked? And the summons, verse 3, judge for the poor and fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and destitute. Verse 4, rescue the poor and needy, deliver them out of the hand of the wicked. Because remember, and remember this always, a society is to be judged more than anything else by how it treats its weakest members. the poor, the fatherless, the afflicted, the destitute, the needy. What are you doing for them? And in the context here, of course, the answer is nothing. Just as we saw in Isaiah chapter 3, breakdown of society. The judges aren't doing their job. They know not, we read in Psalm 82, verse 5. Neither do they understand. They go about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth totter, falter. Everything is collapsing. Society is undone. It's not supposed to be this way. Verse 6, I said, you are angelic beings, and all of you sons of the Most High. That's what you could have been. You should have been. Nevertheless, you shall die like men, fall like one of the princes. And since man is not doing his job, man is not judging sons. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall possess all the nations. So that summons for God, as it were, to arise. Obviously, shouldn't be misconstrued as a literal wake-up call, but rather the realization that since we're not doing our job as God summoned us to do, God needs to, as it were, move in and pick up the slack. Now, we should stress, first and foremost, and this is indeed apropos again of the emphasis upon the weak members of society, as we saw it expressed both in Isaiah chapter 3 and in Psalm 82, that we consider just who needs to be the focus and who is described as the focus in this vein. The theme of arrogance and pride can never be far from our minds and our hearts in reading these passages, especially in the book of Isaiah. Because Isaiah, perhaps more than any other prophet, stresses precisely the critical importance of rehabilitating that pride in lowliness of spirit. In Isaiah chapter 57, verse 15, for thus says the high and lofty one who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. God is indeed exalted. God truly is the high and lofty one. But as for human beings, what God says is, I dwell in the high and holy place, with him also that is of a crushed and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the crushed ones. God, in his exaltedness, specifically with those who are below. And indeed, in much the same vein, in the very last chapter of Isaiah, in chapter 66, the chapter begins, thus says God, the heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. Where is the house that you may build unto me? Where is the place that may be my resting place? For all these things, verse 2, has my hand made. And so all these things came to be, says God. But, critically important, on this man will I look. Even on him that is poor and of a crushed spirit and trembles at my word. Because that, after all, is most critically important. And again, it is in the same vein that in chapter 3, Isaiah sees God as indicting those who most unpardonably are crushing grinding the faces of the poor. But there's an additional dimension that I think it's also critical for us to emphasize. And God rising as we saw it expressed at the end of Psalm 82, a rise of God judge the earth. And in Isaiah chapter 3, God standing to enter into judgment, God coming into judgment. There's a theme here, critically important theme, of divine immanence. God being revealed. And this is arguably the strongest medicine of all. The great and terrible day of the Lord. The day of God is a theme that we encounter also repeatedly in the words of the prophets. And I think it is instructive for us to consider just how dire the day of God, the day of the Lord is. In Isaiah chapter 13, verse 6, howl you, for the day of God is at hand. As destruction, spoiling from the Almighty shall it come. And similarly, in verse 9, behold, the day of God comes cruel and full of wrath and fierce anger, to make the earth a desolation and to destroy the sinners thereof out of it. In almost exactly the same words as in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 6, we also encounter the prophecy of Yoel. It's hard for us to establish who came first because the dating of Yoel is subject to much controversy and uncertainty. But in Joel chapter 1, verse 15, alas, for the day of God is at hand, and as a destruction, or spoiling from the Almighty shall it come. In the prophecies of Joel, we find this theme of the day of God emerging repeatedly. In chapter 2, in verse 2, it is described as a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness as blackness spreads upon the mountains. This is the day of God that is coming. And as a result, in the previous verse, in verse 1, that all the inhabitants of the land quake, for the day of God is coming, it is at hand. And by way of conclusion, as it were, in chapter 2, verse 11, for great is the day of God and very terrible, who can abide it? And the same theme, again, in his prophecy in chapter 3, verse 4, the sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of God comes. Although simultaneously, there is the promise of deliverance. Whosoever shall call on the name of God will be delivered. Among the remnant, those whom God shall call, simultaneously, it is a day of devastation and destruction. Likewise, in Joel chapter 4, where the theme is clearly a universal one, we read in verse 12 that all the nations be stirred up and come up the valley of Yehoshaphat. We've noted in the past that Yehoshaphat means God will judge. For there will I sit to judge all the nations round about. Verse 14, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of God is near in the valley of decision. The sun and the moon darken, and the stars withdraw their shining. The same thing that we saw previously as well. Day of God, terrifying. And so, of course, we can well appreciate that the prophet Amos practically taunts the people. Woe unto you that desire the day of God. In chapter 5, verse 18. Wherefore would you have the day of God? It is darkness and not light. Metaphor in verse 19, as if a man did flee from a lion and a bear met him and came into the house and leaned his hand on a wall and the serpent bit him. Verse 20, shall not the day of God be darkness and not light, even very dark and no brightness in it? And likewise, in the prophecy of Tzfanya, here the day of God is described as a day of slaughter. In verse 8 it is, and it shall come to pass in the day of God's slaughter that I will punish the princes and the king's sons and all such as are clothed with foreign apparel, punishment, destruction. The great day of God is near and hastens greatly. We read in verse 14. And what is that day? In verse 15, that day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of wasteness and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Verse 16, a day of the horn and alarm against the fortified cities and against the high towers. Okay. This is the day of God. And maybe as a final crowning citation, the last of the prophets in the last of the verses of his prophecy, the end of the Hebrew prophets, Malachi, chapter 3, the last two verses of the last chapter, verses 23 and 24. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of God. And you shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children and the heart of the children to the fathers, lest I come and smite the land with utter destruction. So, this theme of the day of God coming, as indeed we saw in Isaiah chapter 3, God coming to judge. Seems pretty terrifying, does it not? Doesn't seem to be anything at all to which to aspire, for which to hope. And maybe in that vein, returning to the theme of God coming, as expressed elsewhere in Isaiah. In the last chapter of Isaiah, chapter 66, in verses 15 and 16, for behold, God will come in fire, and his chariots will be like the whirlwind, to render his anger with fury and his rebuke with flames of fire. For by fire will God enter into judgment, and by his sword with all flesh, and the slain of God will be many. And in very similar terms, in Isaiah chapter 30, verse 27, behold, the name of God comes from afar. Again, God coming. What does that mean? With his anger burning and thick uplifting of smoke, his lips are full of indignation and his tongue is as a devouring fire. And as we read in verse 28, he sits the nations with a sieve of destruction, and a bridle that causes terror shall be in the jaws of the peoples. Once again, the theme of destruction. And yet, the very next verse, in verse 29, heralds restoration. You shall have a song as in the night when a feast is hallowed, and gladness of heart as when one goes with a pipe to come into the mountain of God, the rock of Israel. Now, what in the world is that doing there? Obviously, we'll need to discuss this at greater length when we get to Isaiah chapter 30. There is a general principle to which we've already made reference that, of course, needs to be borne in mind in considering a passage like this. And this is a point that we've already noted, namely, that the words of the prophets were, first and foremost, addressed to their contemporaries, to the events that took place in their time. First and foremost, then, they speak to those who are experiencing those very events. By extension, the words of the prophets also speak to us and apply in varying degrees and in varying ways to the events, circumstances, the challenges that continue to confront us this day. So, of course, when we consider Isaiah chapter 30 in context, the prophet is describing the annihilation of the forces of Assyria. The army of Assyria laying siege round about the holy city of Jerusalem, and in a night, the angel of God goes forth in the encampment and smites 185,000 soldiers. And by morning, no one's left. And Jerusalem is saved. So when God comes in judgment, when God sifts the nations with a civil destruction, indeed, there is cause for singing and gladness on the part of the intended victims of the nations who are thereby saved. And speaking of the night when a feast is hallowed, by our tradition, the destruction of the forces of Assyria took place on the night of Passover. The night when everyone was singing the songs of thanksgiving to God in besieged Jerusalem and the city saved. So, of course, we appreciate the singing together with the themes of his anger burning and being full of indignation and so on, by the very simple realization that when the wicked are destroyed, their intended victims are relieved. Further amplifying this theme, in Isaiah chapter 40, verses 9 and 10, we read of God coming, and there isn't any message here at all of destruction, of devastation, of wrath, of anger. Rather, on the contrary, it is exclusively a prophecy of consolation and restoration. Verse 9, "O you who tells good tidings to Zion, get you up into the high mountain. O you who tells good tidings to Jerusalem, lift up your voice with strength, lift it up, be not afraid. Say unto the cities of Judah, behold your God." Verse 10, "Behold, God the Lord will come with a strong hand, and his arm will rule for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him." So, of course, the simple explanation of how we can greet the coming of God with such exultation when it is described in such terrible, such terrifying terms is also, after all, the reward for the righteous. Destruction for the wicked, reward for the righteous. So the righteous in Isaiah chapter 30, verse 29 are singing, and in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 10, they are confident, looking forward to the reward, the recompense that is with God, which undoubtedly is part of the picture. Part of the picture of how we relate to the coming of the day of God. But I think there's an additional dimension that should be stressed as well. A dimension that is perhaps most aptly expressed in a number of passages in the Holy Writings, at the end of Psalm 96, at the end of Psalm 98, and toward the end of King David's prayer in Chronicles 1, chapter 16. Specifically, returning to Psalm 96, verses 11, 12, and 13, the end of the chapter. Let the heavens be glad and let the earth rejoice. Let the sea roar and the fullness thereof. Let the field exult and all that is therein. Then shall all the trees of the wood sing for joy before God, for he is come. For he is come to judge the earth. He will judge the world with righteousness and the people in his faithfulness. In Psalm 98, verses 7, 8, and 9, let the sea roar and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. Let the rivers clap their hands, let the mountains sing for joy together before God, for he is come to judge the earth. He will judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with equity. And in much the same terms, in the first book of Chronicles, chapter 16, let the heavens be glad, let the earth rejoice. Let them say among the nations, God reigns, let the sea roar and the fullness thereof, let the field exult and all that is therein. Then shall the trees of the wood sing for joy before God, for he is come to judge the earth. Now, the obvious question that one can't help but ask with respect to each one of these passages is, what's the celebration? God is coming to judge. And let's face it, we know very well that even the most righteous among us is far from perfect. After all, as we express it in Ecclesiastes, chapter 7, verse 20, there is no man righteous in all the earth who could do good and not sin. So, shouldn't judgment terrify us? Why is everyone clapping hands and rejoicing, roaring? What's the singing of joy and all the like? And I think when one considers the message in these passages and the implications with respect to the coming of the day of God, there is likewise a critically important message that impacts directly on the remedy, the rehabilitation, the medicine of Isaiah chapter 3. The antidote, really, when one considers it, is practically explicit in the words that we just saw. Returning to Psalm 96, verse 13, what's the phrase that gets repeated? Before God, for he is come. For he is come to judge the earth. Yes, indeed, we don't deny that God is coming to judge the earth. So, of course, on the one hand, we recognize that when God comes, when we feel that closeness to God, that imposes upon us responsibility, that in itself results in judgment. When you are inside the king's palace, you're obviously being held to a far higher standard of conduct than if you were to be someplace out on the countryside. So when God comes, there is judgment. But the converse, when God judges, there's that closeness. He's come. And let's emphasize again the recurrent problem. Arrogance, pride. Arrogance and pride because of people who are insecure, who need to compensate for their own feeling of insignificance. When God comes, you know how significant you are. When God comes, there is judgment. And it's terrifying. But it's also an extraordinary gift of feeling that closeness to God that is, after all, the ultimate antidote to everything that ails us. Because it is through that closeness to God that we're able to experience just how significant we are in his world. Through the judgment, through the process. So indeed, in these passages, there's all this exaltation, the heavens are glad, the earth rejoices, and so on and so forth. For he is come. For he is come. And of course, again, we reiterate that it is that theme, God entering into judgment, God coming into judgment, in Isaiah chapter 3, that's a critical component. On the one hand, of the rebuke. The spoil of the poor is in your houses, and so on. But also of the rehabilitation. Because, of course, it's always important for us to bear this principle in mind as well. God's punishments are not intended to destroy. God's punishments are intended to redirect us, to rehabilitate us. Ultimately, it's in order to redeem us. So God is coming. Now, of course, simultaneously, we stress in the continuation of the chapter, there are stern words of rebuke. Verse 16, moreover, God said, because the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with stretched forth necks and wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go and making a tinkling, spouting venom with their feet. And verse 16 introduces yet another section of rebuke that is structurally. We had the first section of rebuke in this unit in Isaiah in chapter 2, beginning with verse 5 and continuing until the end of the chapter. The second section of rebuke, beginning at the beginning of verse 3 and continuing through verse 15, to break down a society generally. The third section of rebuke is described, whether literally or metaphorically, in terms of the rebuke of the daughters of Zion. From verse 16 and on, really the rebuke and the punishment, continuing through chapter 4, verse 1. The consequence of the arrogance and the haughtiness is, of course, predictably. Remember, you always eat the fruit of your doings. In that day, God will take away all the glory. And there's a long list of all the glory that is snatched away, swept away from the arrogant, prideful daughters of Zion. But here again, it's in order to orient them with respect to what is truly of value, where importance, where significance really lies, as opposed to the facade of significance that really lacks any substance at all. As a result, the last verse of chapter 3, her gates will lament and mourn, utterly bereft, she shall sit on the ground. And women are simply desperate in the metaphor here to have some framework for the preservation of their status, because everything is falling apart. They can. Punishment is restoration. And that brings us into the final section, which is Isaiah chapter 4, from verse 2 and on through verse 6, the end of the chapter. Just as the section began with the opening 4 verses of chapter 2 and the rousing vision of restoration of the future, so too the unit ends in these verses. In that day shall the growth, the sprout of God be beautiful and honorable, and the fruit of the land excellent and glorious for them that are escaped of Israel. So, of course, The first theme that we encounter here, the growth, sprout, in the Hebrew, the term is tzemach, which means a plant, that which grows up, can be understood as either literally, that is, the restoration of the vegetation, the fertility of land, or metaphorically, the restoration of people who are planted in the land of Israel. Both, of course, are true. The theme is one that is perhaps most expressed in Ezekiel chapter 36, a prophecy unto the mountains of Israel, the mountains of Israel that are in a state of such utter desolation. The enemy speaks against you, and you have become desolate, swallowed up on every side, and to the mountains of Israel. The prophet Ezekiel is charged to direct the words. In verse 7, therefore thus says the Lord God, I have lifted up my hand, surely the nations that are round about you, the nations that have shamed and disgraced you, you have borne the shame of the nations, in verse 6. They now shall bear their shame. And what follows in verse 8 is a verse that is of such resounding significance. But you, O mountains of Israel, you shall shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit to my people Israel, for they are at hand to come. And of course, I must stress, in our tradition, while we realize there are many signs of the times, indications of how God's plan is unfolding, there is none so manifest, so explicit as this. Again, shoot forth your branches and yield your fruits to my people Israel, for they are at hand to come. That when the land of Israel, once again, bountifully brings forth its fruit, there is no more definitive sign that my people Israel are at hand to come, the ingathering of the exiles. And of course, I feel compelled to stress here, we've noted this in the past, anyone who has read Innocents Abroad, the travel log of the American author Mark Twain from the mid-19th century, coming through this land, and reads of the extent to which he encountered a land in utter devastation. Practically not a living soul. A land that was so unfertile that even the olive tree, that fast friend of worthless soils, had all but abandoned the countryside. Nothing. And you look today. You know, the land of Israel is, I believe, the only land on earth in which the percent of forestation increased over the course of the past century. Increased dramatically. The land, of course, brings forth its fruit, bountifully once more. And these are the words of the prophet, I am for you, I will turn unto you, and you will be worked and sown, and I will multiply men upon you, and all the house of Israel, even all of it, and the cities will be inhabited, and the waste places will be built. All of these, words of consolation, words of promise, words of restoration, as expressed long before Ezekiel in these words of Isaiah, with a particular emphasis on the glory. So the glory is expressed, of course, in particular with respect to the fruit of the land, excellent and glorious. But the theme of glory becomes a recurrent one, a central one, again, in particular, in the prophecy of Isaiah. The idea that glory is associated with the role of Israel is perhaps first explicitly articulated in Deuteronomy in chapter 26, verse 19, in the context of the bond between us and God. In verse 17, you have avouched God this day to be your God. Verse 18, God has avouched you this day to be his royal property, as he spoke to you in your keeping all his commandments. And verse 19, to make you high above all the nations that he has made in praise, in name, and in glory. But whose praise, name, and glory? Not the praise, the name, and the glory of Israel. No, on the contrary. It's the praise, the name, and glory of God. Not that he needs it, but the world needs it. The world needs to be cognizant of God as the source of praise, the source of renown, the source of glory. And Israel serves as the means through which that message is inculcated in the world. And moving on to Isaiah, again, we encounter this repeatedly. In Isaiah chapter 28, in verse 5, in that day shall the God of hosts be for a crown of beauty and a diadem of glory unto the residue of his people. In Isaiah chapter 46, verse 13, I bring near my righteousness, it shall not be far off, and my salvation will not delay. I will place salvation in Zion for Israel, my glory. Why my glory? In order to project that message to the world. And of course, it doesn't apply only to the people, it applies through the people to the land that broadcasts this message of divinity. In Isaiah chapter 52, verse 1, awake, awake, put on your strength, O Zion, put on your glorious garments, Jerusalem, the holy city. What are the glorious garments? The ingathering of its people, its restoration. In Isaiah chapter 60, in verse 7, God says, I will glorify my glorious house. And with respect to us, God will be unto you an everlasting life. Your God, your glory. And finally, in Isaiah chapter 62, that you will be a crown of glory in the hand of God and a royal diadem in the open hand of your God. Now, what essentially is that telling you? The glory, again, is God's. Our role is to be the means for projecting that glory. And again, not because God needs it. We need it. We need to be able to sense God's greatness and his message and his impact in our lives. Remember, God represents absolute truth, absolute good, absolute justice, absolute righteousness. The glorification of God is the glorification of all these. What could possibly be more critical in the rehabilitation, in the medicine, that erases the bankrupt leadership of arrogance and pride, that ultimately that saves Jerusalem, that saves us. Returning to Isaiah chapter 4, in verse 3, it shall come to pass that he that is left in Zion and he that remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, even every one that is written unto life in Jerusalem. Now, inevitably, these words invoke terrifying prophecy of Ezekiel in chapter 9, where it is the man clothed in linen. In our tradition, this is the angel Gabriel, who, equipped with a writer's tablet, is summoned by God to set a mark upon the foreheads of the men who sigh and moan for all the abominations that are done in the midst of Jerusalem. All those who are, therefore, worthy of being spared. And everyone else, verse 6, slay utterly the old man, the young man, the maiden, the little children, and the woman, but come not near any man upon whom is the mark. Those are the ones who are written for life in Jerusalem. Those are the ones who, as Isaiah expressed it, are called holy. Jeremiah, similarly, after a terrifying chapter 1 of devastation, prophecies of destruction. At the beginning of chapter 2, go and cry in the ears of Jerusalem, saying, thus says God, I remember for you the kindness of your youth, the love of your espousals, how you went after me in the wilderness in a land that was not sown. Israel is God's hallowed portion. Of course, inevitably, it's critically important for us to remember this message of holiness is not simply one of being allied with that holiness in God. It was the pride, the arrogance that divorced us from God and that led to the strong medicine, the medicine of devastation, and destruction, and even a societal breakdown, such that society itself, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. And God was so remote. Because in a world completely bereft of justice, how are you going to sense God? And ultimately, there is the promise of that restoration, with which Isaiah chapter 4 then concludes that when God will have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and rinsed the blood of Jerusalem from its midst by the spirit of judgment and the spirit of destruction, strong medicine. Then, verse 5, God will create over the whole habitation of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud and smoke by day and the shining of flaming fire by night, for over all the glory, in addition to every honor, shall be a canopy, and there shall be a pavilion, tabernacle, for a shadow in the daytime from the heat, and for refuge and for a covert from downpour and from rain. This canopy, cloud, fire. We've read that previously, haven't we? Closing verses of the book of Exodus, chapter 40. Verse 34, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting and the glory of God filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter into the tent of meeting because the cloud abode thereon and the glory of God filled the tabernacle. Verse 38, final verse of the book of Exodus. For the cloud of God was upon the tabernacle by day, and there was fire therein by night in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. Again, strong medicine. Strong medicine. This means healing. As means salvation. What ultimately is that salvation? Well, if you just read about the canopies and the fire and the smoke and all, you might not appreciate what it's all about really is God. God's immanence, our closeness to Him. The problem of pride, arrogance, most essentially was it drove us away from God. It drove us to think that maybe we were God. The real remedy is the realization, as expressed by Asaph at the end of Psalm 73, verse 28. But as for me, the nearness of God is my good. And we find our own significance, our own importance, not through the flimsy compensations for insecurity of speaking of how important we are and how arrogant we are and how prideful we can be, but rather by seeking the meaning in our lives, in our closeness to God, the source of all that is holy, and our becoming His junior partners as He charges us, bringing His blessings into the world. What greater blessing could it possibly be? God bless you.